All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about different kinds of HTML elements, and in particular, how we can write semantically meaningful HTML with the purpose of making sure that HTML is accessible to lots of different kinds of users. So we're going to go through a few examples of why you might sort of pick one HTML element over another, and sort of how to use that when encoding your content or writing out your web pages. So there's no new syntax introduced in this video. It's just sort of considerations of what HTML elements to already use. So that's what I said. We're going to go through the importance of semantics of HTML. We'll talk about choosing the correct elements, then we'll talk a little bit about block and inline elements sort of at the very end briefly. So as we've mentioned previously, HTML is distinct from CSS in that the purpose of HTML is to define the meaning of content, not the appearance of that content. So although HTML elements do include some sort of default appearances, so for example, H1s are big and bold, EM elements are italicized, strong elements are bold, even though there's some default styling sort of applied to HTML elements, you can really think of that as really more coincidental, right? It just so happens that an H1 is bigger and bold. But really, the intention of HTML is that it's going to be able to define the semantic meaning of that text, not what the appearance of that text is, right? Not what it looks like, but what it means, what kind of text it is. So really the intention here is that we want to think about making web pages that are accessible. So the thing that you need to kind of remember as you're doing web development is that web pages, while they are primarily a visual medium, they're not only accessible as visual systems, right? A website could be visited by someone who isn't able to see, right? It can be visited by blind users. They can be visited by things like bots and search engines that need to be able to understand your content. They might be sort of really run by crawlers or indexers, right? So in order to be able to like produce search systems, you can be able to sort of, be able to go find and look up things that are on websites. In order to have all that stuff work, we're going to be able to support both computing systems that don't see the page and users who don't necessarily see the page because they're accessing some other kind of device, like a screen reader for various reasons. We want to make sure that our content is sort of correctly semantically annotated, right? We actually want to make sure that when we use HTML to annotate, to describe some content, we are actually being accurate when we say this is what that element is, as opposed to just what does it look like. And this is, again, trying design to make pages accessible is really one of the main drivers behind why we want to do this, as well as just being correct. So to be clear, when I say semantic, when I'm sort of using this word, I'm using the idea semantic as like the meaning of that. So when we say semantic HTML, we mean HTML where the use of the HTML reflects the meaning, the purpose of that text, not the appearance, but the meaning. So as sort of a fundamental example of this, it's one of the basic examples, is we could talk about using heading elements, right? H1s, H2s, H3s, and so on. So by default, the browser is going to make these appear as big and bold, right? They're going to sort of make it so when you make an H1, it's going to show up as sort of a large piece on a page. I have like, as an example, like I made like a little header page, a little like sort of personal page about me with, no styling, but like H1s are big and bold, H2s are slightly less big and slightly in, but they're just as bold, right? So again, we're going to be able to see what that content looks like. But the point here is that, right? So a lot of times students will beginning web developers will think, oh, I want my text to be bigger and bolder, I better make it into an H1, right? They think H1 means big and bold. But that's not the purpose, right? H1 is not an appearance element. H1 is used to semantically refer to the headings of our page, right? Headings are used for navigation and organization. They're like chapter titles, effectively, or subsect chapter titles. And we'll talk more in a later video about sort of exactly how we think about this sort of these headings as organizers. But the point, because the idea is that if you try to use these just because this text is bigger and bolder, then when a screen reader tries to use that to navigate, to sort of walk through the table of contents of your web page, it's going to get lost. It's not going to it's going to think that this H2, which you just wanted to be a little bit larger, it's going to think, oh, that must be like a new section of my page, or that's a new chapter that I'm on. And then it's going to make it really hard for blind users to be able to actually navigate and sort of understand what your content is because you haven't actually encoded it correctly. So we really want to be careful that we're not using elements because of their appearance. We're using them because of their meaning. So we don't want to say like, oh, I want some text that's big, so we use an H2 to do that. We really want to say, okay, if I want this text to be big, well, if it's just plain text, it's a paragraph, so we would define it as a paragraph element. And then we could use some CSS, some styling to say, oh, well, let's make that paragraph bigger and bolder, right? We can make it like 175% of its normal size, and we can make it bolder if we want to change how it looks like. So again, we use semantic HTML, but then we can use CSS to figure out, well, okay, if I want to change its appearance. The same kind of thing actually happens with links and buttons. So we may not be doing quite as many buttons in this class, but it's a good way of sort of thinking through this when you're trying to think through like designs of your page. So if we're doing any kind of navigation, right, if I want to click on something and I want that something to take me to a different web page or show me something new, right, basically take me to a different location, then we're going to use anchor elements, the A elements, for doing that kind of work. Button elements, on the other hand, are used for like if we're interacting with the current page, right? If I want to submit a form, I use a button. If I want to potentially like change like only a little piece of the page, but most of it stays the same, that would be a button, right? Buttons handle interaction, not navigation, not moving from one place to another. So I don't want, even if you want something that looks button-like, if that thing is a link, if that thing is taking you to another web page, we wouldn't use something like a button to do that, right? I wouldn't want to have a button that says, click here to take me to the info page, click here to view some info. What we'd want to do instead is we'd want to create an anchor element, right? A hyperlink that has a target, says, okay, this is where I'm going to navigate to some other page, or my info.html page. And then I could use a whole bunch of CSS, and this is sort of just an example of a whole bunch of different kinds of rules we could apply in order to make it look like a button. So you could end up having things that on the page appear button-like, but they're not actually buttons, they're anchor elements. So that if a screen reader is trying to access this page, it doesn't think, oh, when I click this button, something's going to change here. It knows that if I click this thing, it's going to take me to a new location. I can be able to then handle that and sort of figure out what kind of verbal mapping we're creating out of that site. So again, we can use CSS. We pick elements based on their semantics, right? Pick anchor elements because it's a link, and then we can use CSS to then make it look like a button, make it look like something totally different if we want to. The appearance and the meaning are actually disjoint. They actually don't. They aren't required to be like linked up at all. So another example. So HTML does include some elements that don't have sort of semantic meaning, that are just appearance-based element. The most common ones you'll hear about potentially, or you might find if you're digging around on the internet for stuff, is the I element and the B element, which stands for the italics element and the bold element. This is how HTML used to be written back before CSS came into existence. And so these can be used to style your page. However, as we mentioned previously, they don't have any actual semantic meaning, right? Saying that something is italics doesn't mean anything. It just says the text is slanty. And slanty text doesn't mean anything. It's just a way of things looking like that. You can make all text slanty because you just think slanty letters are nice. So we don't want to do work where we're trying to say, oh, I'm going to write some HTML that indicates the appearance of stuff. What we really want to do instead is to use CSS to indicate that appearance. If we do want something to be italicized or bold for some reason, then we can pick HTML elements that will then describe that reason, and then we can have the styling be applied from that. So for example, we can use an EM element that says that I'm going to be italicized because I'm important, right? So things that we want to emphasize, we stick and mark with an EM. And then as we mentioned previously, we can be able to use CSS to actually make it so it's not just italicized, it's also big and red and flashing and whatever else we want to do, right? We can make something that says it's bold because it's really important, right? That's why we use a strong element. And there's actually a number of other elements that exist as well. Sort of the one that I come across the most often, for example, is there's an element called a cite element. And a cite element is used to indicate a citation. Namely, when you have things like a book title, right? We're saying that's a thing we want to be able to sort of cite and note as like another resource or another thing. We can use a citation element to sort of mark that as like, oh, this text here is a book title. It's something special. And that will, by default, make it look italicized, but you can also then style it in different kinds of ways depending on what you're looking for. So there's a number of these kinds of what are called semantic elements that are used to sort of, again, stylize the text, but they're really used to annotate those words. Say, oh, these words are distinct from sort of the rest of my words, and here's what they mean. So that systems like web crawlers and screen readers and, so human and computer-based systems will be able to understand that text without just having to look at it and try to interpret it based on the visual cues. Because again, not everyone is able to interpret visual cues from a website. Okay. So somewhat similarly, we don't want to be able to use, if we're trying to do things like figure out line breaks or spacing of elements, we don't want to try to use HTML to do that work. We again want to use CSS for this. So if we're trying to create like breaks in text, we want to use something like a paragraph to indicate these are distinct paragraphs. We don't want to use a purely visual element like there is a BR element, which stands for a break, like a line break element. But we don't want to do that because it's going to go ahead and again, that doesn't have any semantic meaning. That's just saying, oh, let's try to put a break inside of our text somewhere. Similarly, you don't want to try to add, you'll see this in some in like auto-generated sites, for example. You don't want to try to add paragraphs of empty content to add extra spacing. We'd want to use CSS to say, let's just make the space between these paragraphs bigger. Don't put a bunch of blank empty lines in the middle. Not like a Word document where you have to like hit enter a bunch of extra times. In HTML, we would actually just say, here are 2 paragraphs, and then we could just make more white space between them by using CSS to style the spacing. Don't worry about trying to say like, oh, I need to figure out line breaks in my browser. The browser is going to automatically wrap text if that text gets too long. So again, if we look at like, I have a little paragraph about me on the web page, on this web page, depending on the size of my browser, the text sort of wraps around, right? So if my browser is really wide, then the text sort of only needs to take up 2 lines. But as my browser gets smaller, it takes up more. This is the exact same thing that Word does when you're typing out an essay, right? You don't have to hit enter at the end of every line of Word. It will automatically sort of wraps it around to the next line in order to sort of be able to make everything come together the way we want. In general, it's best to let the browser automatically do this kind of styling work. Don't try to force line breaks at any particular time. You're not going to be accurate, and the likelihood of the browser that someone's actually looking at being a couple pixels, a little bit too small or a little bit too big so it doesn't quite match your appearance is really, really high. Best practice is really going to be just to let the browser do as much as it can for the context that it's in. And so we only want to define semantic meanings behind this, and we can then do some styling around that, but really let the browser do some of the work. Don't feel you have to do that extra work. So again, what we do is if I want to have 2 distinct paragraphs, right? If I want to have this be paragraph 1 and then paragraph 2 somewhere else, I would use 2 distinct paragraphs. I wouldn't try to make one paragraph with a line break in the middle, because again, that line break doesn't mean anything. But if I'm saying, oh, I want there to be a break because they're different paragraphs, we actually want to use different paragraphs. That's the point. Kind of related, we actually also don't want to introduce line breaks in our source code either. So if we're writing out this paragraph in the source code, you'll notice that I have this whole thing is actually 1 line of code, right? It's line 17, and then line 18 is sort of the next, or 19 is the next paragraph. This is because just like Word, your web editor, right, your coding editor, VS Code will wrap text from 1 line to the next. We can actually turn this off by, if you go into our view menu, right, I can turn off the word wrapping. And now it shows us that this is 1 giant line of code, which is fine, right? I have to scroll way over to the side in order to see all that content. And that's okay. That's actually how we want to write HTML. We don't want to be trying to be like, oh, I need to go ahead and this is getting off the side of my browser, so I need to go hit enter, right? We don't want to have to do that kind of work manually, right? Just like you wouldn't want to do that work manually if you're writing an essay, right? You don't want to have to hit line breaks every individual place, because then if you decide that you want to change the text, right? If we want to say that I am currently an associate professor, and I want to change the wording a little bit, well, now I have to go re-hit enter and I have to go re-space everything, and that's going to be a waste of my time, right? It's a bunch of extra work I don't want to deal with. So if we want to do is we really want to keep everything on sort of each set of text, each paragraph on sort of 1 line of code, but we can then, again, use this word wrap feature to be able to make it so that I can then see everything and read it just like I would read a Word document. So that will make it easier for me to read what's going on without having to scroll back and forth side to side, but it also means that I don't have to then reformat things whenever I change my text. Again, we're going to use the capabilities of our editor just like you use the capabilities of Word or any other system that you're using to write text. Yeah, so don't do that. Cool. But yeah. So I do need to mention, though, that there are a couple of non-semantic elements, right? Like elements that don't have any semantic meaning, right? They're not trying to describe anything about the text that we do use when we're writing HTML. The most common one of these non-semantic elements, the one that's sort of okay to use, is what's called a div. It's a div element. So div in this case stands for division, and it's used to divide, to sort of structure our web page. So a div has no actual semantic or appearance meaning on its own. So having content inside of a div won't change what it looks like. It has no visual appearance. It also doesn't change its semantic meaning. It doesn't actually mean anything. Browsers, like screen readers, will basically ignore the fact that it's a div. They just say, okay, that's fine, whatever, they ignore it. What divs are used to do is they're used to group together elements, generally for styling. So if I'm looking at sort of my web page example here, right, I have this kind of this section where it's sort of this about me, and then I've got some text and I've got a picture, and those are sort of part of the same section, part of the same part of my web page. So what I could do is I can put all of that content inside of a div, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new div element and have all of this content that's grouped together be children, be part of inside of that div. This is what we call wrapping the element inside of a div, right? Think about like wrapping it like wrapping a present, right? We are putting a div around this content, right? So I can say, great, here is one part of my page. Here's one chunk grouping of content. Similarly, I could put a set of content around my sort of links area at the bottom here, and then I can have these distinct bits of content, right? It doesn't change any of our actual appearance of any of our page, right? It all stayed exactly the same. What this reason we'll then do this is we use this primarily for things like styling, right? So if I want to be able to then refer, where'd my browser go? If I want to then be able to style just these elements, or I want to style this part of the page, we can write some CSS to do that. We could use, and we'll talk about this in a later video, but we can use what's called a class selector. So we could basically say, like, let's style the about section, write some CSS that styles the about section. Again, we'll talk about how this code works in a minute. And I could give it, for example, a background color of gray, maybe a light gray, right? And then I can sort of make that section be styled distinct from other sections. So what we end up doing is we end up using these divs not for any built-in appearance reasons and not for any semantic reasons, but we're going to use them in order to group content together so I can then refer to that group of content when I'm styling my page, when I'm deciding what it's going to look like. Yeah, and so we're going to use divs a lot. You'll actually see divs if you go look at any web page in the world, you're going to see divs all over the place. A lot of the modern web is built as divs that contain other divs, that contain other divs, that contain other divs in order to group and group and group and regroup all these sections, so that each grouping has its own set of styling, and then you've got smaller groups that have their own set of styling in that, and smaller groups have their own set of styling in that, and you sort of build it up together and actually can make these, and that's how we get these very complex looking web pages. So here's a relatively simple example, and again, they get more complex than this, where I can have a div that represents a group of cards. Think like cards you might see on a web page where you have like different tags, different boxes that have content in them. Right, so I can have a group of cards, and then inside of that, I've got a div that represents one of these cards. Inside that, there's a div that represents the header of the card, right, card header. And then I've got another div that represents the body of that card. And then I have my actual content, right? There's my H2, and there's a paragraph. And then I can have another div for another card, and so on and so forth. So the idea is I can basically organize what's really 5 lines of text, right? The word featured, card 1, an information card, card 2, and another information card, which I've semantically annotated to say that this is a heading 2, this is a heading 2, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, this is nothing. But I'm using the divs to organize those things together so that I can style them in groups. I can make the body of the card look one way, the whole card itself look another way, and then the grouping of cards look its own way as we go. So we're going to do a lot of this kind of work as we get further and further into building out CSS and into building out sort of styling for pages, is that we'll define all of our semantic content, right, our H2s and our paragraphs, and then we'll often start adding in these extra divs in order to then add in styling around that content. So the content stays, again, the same, right? The screen reader only reads the content that's important. All this stuff ends up just being extra code that's added to make it look nice for sighted users who are then able to see that. But as long as we're keeping those things semantically distinct, right? We're not trying to make my H2 look like a card, then the screen reader and the appearance will be kept separate, and they'll be able to make it much easier for us to both develop the page and for make sure that no one's getting confused when they're trying to access, any blind user trying to access the page are not sort of getting things mixed up because the semantic are wrong. Okay. Div does have a counterpart. A div is an example of what's called a block element. So a block element is a element that basically takes up the entire width of the page. It acts as an entire block of content. So paragraphs are considered block elements. Headings are considered block elements. You can see these in the developer tools, right? So if we open up our developer tools that we talked about in a previous video, I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller so we can see it. right? If we mouse over the content here, right, if I go to this H1, we can see that this H1, oh, here, I'll go there, right? So I can't point with the mouse, but the H1 you can see goes across the page, right? There's that big blue box off to the side where I've got to say, hey, that Joel Ross thing is the entire length of my page because it is this block element. The next element down, this next div is also a block element, right? These blocks are going to sit on top of each other as they go. Comparatively, for example, if we look at the links down here, right, go to my link section down here, right, I've got each of these paragraphs that, again, are these block elements, right? The paragraph covers the whole page, so each paragraph has to sit on top of each other. But inside of that paragraph, I have an anchor element that's what's called an inline element. The anchor element sort of just, it sits in the line, in the middle of the text with everything else around it. So if I try to adding in EM elements or anchor elements or sort of these things that are basically just modifying a couple of words, not an entire chunk of text, those are referred to as inline elements. So this is not a syntax thing, but this is a thing, right? I could, for example, if I want to if I want to emphasize the University of Washington Information School because it's important, right? I can make that change. And then if we look at that element, right, that here is an inline element, right? It's an own element, but it's sort of inline with the rest of my text. So the distinction between block and inline elements are useful for sort of initial styling, right? Blocks basically have line breaks after them, inline elements don't. But it's also a way of trying to think through, is this like its own thing on the page, its own section, or is it going to be more of like I'm just modifying some words in the middle? Okay, so a span is an element that's kind of like a div, right? Divs, again, have no semantic or appearance meaning, but a span is the same thing, but inline. So while I might say, let's take some paragraphs and put them inside of a div to, again, style them, but provide no actual meaning, I could take a span and put that around a single word, like this word black here, in order to add some styling to it without giving it any actual semantic meaning. So for example, if I just wanted to make this word black be a dark word, right? I just want it to look black because I just think it'd be funny for like the color to be slightly different. I can then add a span to do that kind of work. Spans are it's worth noting they exist because you will see them and they're occasionally useful. They're not actually super common. Generally, if you're trying to style an individual word, there's a reason for it, right? There's some purpose behind why you want that word to be red, or why you want that word to be bigger, or why you want that word to blink, or why you want that word to be distinct. There's some reason for it, some meaning behind that appearance difference. That's how we're communicating to other people. So you'll generally want to use a semantic element, right? If that word is important, you'd use an EM. If that word is really important, you use strong. If that word is a book title, you use cite. If that word is a hyperlink, you'd use an anchor. You would use some semantic element to annotate that word, and then you could style that individual semantic element however you want it. So spans you can see them occasionally, but they're not super useful. Unlike divs, because divs are the primary block for styling sections of our page, we will see divs that show up all over the place. So we're going to use these over and over and over and over again. Yeah. All right. So that's the main idea here. So again, the main takeaway to use here is that we want to use HTML elements that accurately represent the semantic meaning of our page content, regardless of their appearance, right? What they look like doesn't actually matter when you're deciding what your HTML should be. What you shouldn't be thinking about, oh, this needs to be big, use an H1. We should think, okay, this is my heading, therefore it's an H1. It doesn't matter what it wants to look like. Think first about, okay, what is it going to look like if I'm just trying to annotate and describe this text? So often when we're writing HTML, you really want to think of it almost at like the source code level, right? I want to say, okay, I'm writing some content, but now I want to put some markers to indicate, well, this thing here is a paragraph. This thing here is going to be another image. So in order to be able to loop those things together. There's a little bit of both where you're like, okay, well, I want this to be on its own line, so therefore I'm going to make it its own paragraph. Like there's a little bit going back and forth where you're kind of not thinking about appearance, but also kind of are thinking about the appearance a little bit. But we don't want to be beholden to the appearance when choosing our semantic elements. We want to think semantically, what does this mean? Is this thing a list? Is this thing a paragraph? What is it going to be? Code that up in the HTML, and then only after we've sort of decided what it is semantically, what the HTML content actually is, what it means, then we can go about adding some CSS and adding some styling to be able to decide what it looks like, no matter what its semantic happens to be. right? If this thing was an anchor, was a link, we made it look like a link, even if you then want to add some styling to make it look more like a button or make it more look like an icon or make it look like something else, right? We want to add that content semantically first, and then we style it after. So again, that's the main takeaway from this video, right? Is that when we're writing HTML, think about the semantic meaning. What does that element mean? What actually is that thing? Don't be thinking about the appearance after your HTML, then get to your CSS, then you can begin thinking about your appearance.